Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 250. Cecil Pierpont. Part 1. Acknowledgement to David Fox for his contribution on a public family tree to assist in telling the story. Cecil Pierpont was one of a number of aliases that he used during his time in Australia. Other aliases included Cecil Rowe, Professor Gordon Rowe, Cecil Devine, Gordon Vane Tempest Simpson, Gordon Tempest, Gordon Burge, Gordon de Burgh, Cecil Royal Aubrey, Cecil Devine, John Soames and Sydney Bruce Burge. He was also married a number of times, including to several women at the same time. He appears to have been born Thomas Henry Augustine Penney in Southampton, England on the 27th of September 1865 to Isaac Penney, an assurance agent, and Eliza Leach. He was the youngest of 3 children. He married Gertrude Therese Maria Hempstead in July 1883 at Tonbridge, Kent in the UK. He was 18 and she was 23. Thomas and Gertrude had a boy, Trum St Clair Augustine Penney, on the 19th of April 1884 at Hurst Green, Kent, England. Thomas Penney was put on trial on the 4th of January 1886 at Reading, Berkshire, England, and the title of the article is Fraud at Twyford. Thomas Henry Penney, who gave his address as Cyprins Villa, Kington Langley, Chippenham, was brought up on remand from Friday, charged with obtaining at Twyford on the 10th of July the sum of £4 and 7 shillings, the money of John Ombler, hairdresser, by false pretences. The prisoner was apprehended on the 29th of October on his discharge from Devizes Jail, where he had undergone 3 months' hard labour for a larceny at Swindon. He got the prosecutor to change a cheque for £4 7 shillings and purchased several articles, altogether to the value of 12 shillings and 11 pence. He represented himself as Mr. Alfred Hempstead, travelling inspector of a fire insurance company, and said he was in search of a suitable person to take the office of district superintendent. The cheque was returned after a few days with no account. The prisoner absconded, and in the course of a few days, information was received that he was in custody at Swindon on a charge of larceny. So he was charged with obtaining money and goods by false pretences. He was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment on the first charge, and as he'd already been in prison for 2 months on the second charge, the court decided that a further sentence of 2 months' hard labour would suffice. He arrived in Australia alone from London in August 1886 on the Beecroft. He stated he was a 26-year-old labourer on the shipping record, making his birth year 1860 instead of 1865. According to his great-granddaughter Rachel Penney, his fare was paid by Gertrude's parents in order to get him out of the country. Apparently the police were knocking on the front door when Thomas left via the back. At some point after Thomas's immigration, Gertrude had him declared dead. He first appeared in Australian court records in Melbourne on the 14th of December 1886 with a charge of larceny, and he received 2 months' hard labour for that crime. It featured in the Melbourne Herald on the 14th of December 1886, A Mean Trick. A young man named Thomas H. Penney was charged with larceny as a bailee of a watch chain, the property of Henry Lancaster. The prosecutor said he was a labourer and living in East Melbourne. He called in at the Apollo Inn in Russell Street on the 1st. He was wearing a chain and a locket, which the prisoner, who was in the hotel, asked a sight of. The complainant gave it to him and went to the backyard. When he returned, the prisoner had gone. The accused was arrested afterwards by Sergeant Griffin. The prisoner also pled guilty to having possession of a prosecutor's watch in an unlawful way. The prosecutor's watch was given to the prisoner to repair, he having pretended he was a watchmaker. He told Detective Griffin, who arrested him, that he sold the watch to Mr. C. Mittleman, pawnbroker in Burke Street West. The pawnbroker was called, and he told the bench he bought the watch absolutely from the prisoner for 10 shillings and had since paid 3 shillings to have it repaired. Mr. Lancaster valued the watch at £4 10 shillings. And then on the 13th of April 1887 in Carlton, he was arrested for larceny and given 3 months' imprisonment. In the Geelong Advertiser, it outlined the case on the 7th of April 1887. A comical-looking individual who gave the name of Thomas H. Penney was charged at the police court yesterday morning with larceny as a bailee. Sergeant Moore applied to have the prisoner remanded to the Melbourne City Police Court and stated that the prisoner had given himself into the custody of the police as he feared that a warrant had been issued for his arrest. Inquiries had been made with regard to the stranger, and it had been elicited that he represented himself to Mr. Arthur Stanley of Carlton as a medical man and stated to him that he was so shabbily dressed that he did not like presenting himself before a patient who resided at Balaclava. Mr. Stanley lent him a grey-coloured mackintosh, an overcoat, a coat and vest, a pair of trousers, and also a silver Geneva watch, which he required to time his patient's pulse. Since the loan of the clothes, valued at £12 10s, Mr. Stanley has not seen Penney, but the articles entrusted to his care have been discovered in a pawn office in Elizabeth Street, Melbourne. A warrant's been taken out for the prisoner's arrest, and an application was granted for a remand. And on the 10th of August 1887 in the Sydney Evening News, alleged larceny of musical instruments. Cecil Devine was charged by Senior Constable Taylor with stealing a flute, the property of Thomas Taswell, valued at 30 shillings, and of larceny as a bailee of a clarinet valued at £5, the property of Thomas Euston. On the application of the police, the prisoner was remanded for a week. And a week later, in the Sydney Morning Herald, Cecil Devine, 25, pled guilty of having stolen a flute and illegally pawned a clarinet. He was sentenced to 3 months hard labour on each charge, the terms to be concurrent. And on the 14th of December 1887 in the New South Wales Police Gazette in Sydney, a warrant's been issued by the Water Police Bench for the arrest of Cecil Devine, charged with uttering a forged cheque for the sum of £13 to Alois Brambach on the 8th. The offender's about 22, 5'6", thin build, fair hair and complexion, slight fair moustache, otherwise clean-shaved, wears eyeglasses, a high forehead, a medical doctor. And 3 days later in the Sydney Australian Star, roguery in broadcloth. A highly enamelled 3-star aristocrat with a Roman nose and a plug hat, answering to the name of Cecil Devine, faced the bench on a charge of uttering a forged cheque to Alois Brambach with intent to defraud. The accused is described as a surgeon, 35 years of age, of superior education. On the application of the police, the accused was remanded until next Thursday. On the 22nd of December 1887 in the Sydney Australian Star, in the Charge Division of the Water Police Court today, a nicely dressed young man named Cecil Devine stood charged with uttering, offering and disposing of a forged cheque to the sum of £13 to one Alois Brambach with the intent to defraud. Detective Greaves, who was in charge of the case, stated that the prisoner, who is well known and has a black record both in the colony and in Melbourne, in which he has done time, entered the music store of Mr. A. Brambach in King Street and selected a piano. He was liberal and placed £10 down on the account. He handed Mr. Brambach a cheque for £13, and the unsuspecting tradesman handed his smug-looking German countryman £3 by way of change. An inquiry into the cheque was found to be valueless. And on the 23rd of December 1887 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, a doctor in trouble. A well-dressed foreigner named Cecil Devine, described as a doctor, was charged before Mr. Fisher at the Water Police Court yesterday with uttering a forged cheque. Detective Greaves deposed that after arresting the prisoner by virtue of a warrant that he read out, in reply to the charge the prisoner said, "I only forged one cheque. Will you allow me to get away with it?" Jacob Hannon, architect, said that the cheque had been taken out of his chequebook without his knowledge, and the signature in it was not his. The prisoner has often been to his office at Hunter Street, where the book was kept. So on the 29th of December 1887 in the Sydney Evening News, Dr. Devine again. Cecil Devine, described as a doctor, who was committed for trial a few days ago on a charge of forging and uttering, was again before the court this morning on 2 charges. The first with forging and uttering a cheque for £13 10s to James Hannon, purporting to be signed by George Blatwick, drawn on the Federal Bank of Australia, and the second charge, forging a cheque for £9 17s on the Federal Bank, purporting to be signed by J.S. Hannon. Detective Roach, who has the case in hand, applied for a remand of 1 week as some of the witnesses are in the country on holidays. The application was granted. And Cecil Devine received 3 years hard labour concurrent for those charges. and he was discharged after 8 months on special remission. In the Central Police Court on the 25th of September 1889, he was brought forward on a charge of stealing, and another case of stealing at the Water Police Court on the 28th of August 1889. On the 16th of August 1889 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, an adventurer, Cecil Devine, alias John Soames, alias T.H. Penney, who has several times appeared before the police courts for different offences, was yesterday arraigned before the bench at the Central Court on a charge of false pretences. It transpired that on the 12th, the prisoner called upon a shopkeeper named Ernest Farry, carrying on business at Pierpont, and asked if Mary Seals lived there. He answered in the affirmative. He then intimated he was a clerk in the employment of Mr. W. Crick's solicitor, and he was about to get up a petition for the release of her husband from jail. Arrangements were subsequently made to meet the woman at 6:30 p.m. on the following Tuesday, when he agreed to take her to Judge Forbes. It would be better, he added, to visit the judge after he'd had his dinner, as he would then have a full stomach and a light heart. The instructions he gave her were that she would have to pull a long face and punch the baby in order to make it cry. He further remarked that it was necessary that a deposit of £3 should be given, but he accepted 30 shillings from Vere, who gave it to him on behalf of his employee. Mr. Crick gave evidence to the effect that the prisoner has never been in his employ, and the bench sentenced him to a period of 6 months' jail with hard labour. And then on the 21st of August 1889, in the Sydney Australian Star, Henry Myers and Cecil Devine, the former described as an artist and wearing eyeglasses and a tall hat, were charged at the Water Police Court this morning with stealing 5 bangles, a silver necklet and locket, a silver brooch, a Jubilee brooch, a purse, a pocket handkerchief, 2 keys, and 3 shillings in money, to the total of £2, the property of Fanny Parks. The prosecutrix's evidence was to the effect that the accused stayed at her house in Redfern on the night of Thursday, August the 8th, and left the following day. When they'd gone, she missed articles. She identified one of the articles produced as a missing property. She'd known Devine for some time and had been living with him. A handkerchief and key identified were found in Myers' possession when arrested, and Devine had the key of the front door in his pocket. Alexander Magoshan, pawnbroker, purchased the 5 bangles, silver necklet and locket and 2 brooches for 6 shillings from Meyer. Devine was acquitted on this charge, and Meyer, who pled guilty, was sent to jail for 6 months. The same accused were remanded on further charges of stealing jewellery. And then on the 28th of August 1889 in the Australian Star, Cecil Devine, alias John Soames, alias J.H. Penney, was before Mr. B. Lee at the Water Police Court this morning, charged with stealing a silver watch, a gold chain and £3 in money from the person of Samuel Miller. The evidence of the prosecutor, who's a commercial traveller residing in Kent Street, showed that on the 7th of August he saw the accused at a hotel in Oxford Street and was thrown off his guard by the prisoner's honeyed expressions. They had a drink together, and then it was that Devine took Miller into his confidence and told him he was a surgeon. Presently more drinks were ordered, and Miller sank into a beautiful state of forgetfulness and remembered nothing more until he found himself in bed at the Grand Hotel the next morning, and wanting to know the time, discovered his watch was gone. A further search showed that money had accompanied the watch. The watch was pawned on the 24th of August at a home in Castlereagh Street for £2 10 shillings. Boots at the Grand Hotel saw Miller and Devine come into the house together on the evening of the 7th of August, and Devine took the watch and money from Miller's pocket, remarking that they were friends and he was going to take care of them. Devine pleaded guilty and informed the bench that since his arrival in the colony 3 years ago, he had not followed his profession as a surgeon. The bench thought he'd followed his profession as a swindler and a thief to some purpose, and sent him to jail for 6 months' hard labour. On a further charge of stealing, he was remanded to the Central Police Court. And on the 29th of August 1889 in the Sydney Australian Star, Vere, surgeon, England. Once more these words appeared on a police sheet at the Central Court today, when Cecil Devine, 27, surgeon of England, was charged with having stolen from the Metropolitan Coffee Palace in George Street silver articles and money, valued at £9, the property of John Stubbs. He was remanded for a week. And on the 6th of September 1889 in the Sydney Daily Telegraph, many times committed. Cecil Devine, an English surgeon, and Henry Myers, alias Maximilian Myers, both of whom stand committed for trial on other charges, were arraigned at the Central Court yesterday for stealing a watch and chain with anchor and compass,
a black and gold pencil case and £3 6 in money. John Stubbs, a billiard maker residing at Jamboree, stopped at the Metropolitan Coffee Palace on the 5th, and on that day he missed from his bedroom the articles. John Webb, assistant to T.W. Hall of Bathurst Street, proved to having purchased a silver pendant from a man he did not know. The watch and chain were found on De Vere when arrested, and the pencil case on Meyer, both prisoners committed for trial at the next quarter sessions. And on the 26th of September 1889 in the Sydney Australian Star, a pair of beauties. Henry Myers and Cecil Devine pled not guilty to an indictment charging them with stealing from the Metropolitan Coffee Palace from John Stubbs, who was lodging at the time at the Coffee Palace. Stubbs stated that he went to bed in a 4-bedded room in which one man was already asleep. Afterwards, one man and then another came in, but he could not identify any of them. He placed his waistcoat containing his watch and money under his pillow, then went to sleep, and when he awoke he found his garment on the opposite bed and his money and watch gone. The prisoners cross-examined the witnesses at length and put forward witnesses to prove that a watch was no guide to its identity, as they are often numbered alike, and that pencils similar to the one produced were sold everywhere by the bundle. The evidence given by these people was, however, the opposite of what was expected, and the prisoners then addressed the jury at length. After consultation for 20 minutes, the jury returned a verdict of guilty against the prisoners. The record shows that Myers, since 1880, has received sentences amounting to 3 years and 11 months, and De Vere has been sentenced to 3 years and 11 months since 1886. De Vere was sentenced to 5 years penal servitude, and Myers the same offence, and an additional 5 years for a previous offence, to which he pled guilty, sentences to be concurrent. After serving this prison sentence, he married Alice Hyacinth Brewer in Sydney on the 12th of October 1896 under the name Cecil Royal Aubrey at Weldon's Matrimonial Association, which appears to be a marriage venue and dating agency, and this was his first bigamous marriage. A little over 2 months later, on the 30th of December 1896, in the Sydney Evening News, Cecil Royal Aubrey, 36, was charged on remand with obtaining £9 from Henry Thomas Philcox Davis by means of a valueless cheque. The prosecutor stated that the accused borrowed £2 from him and some time later gave him a cheque for £10, which he asked him to cash and to retain the amount of the loan with an additional £1 for his kindness. He had, he said, some money cabled out to him from England. The prosecutor cashed the cheque but did not present it for some days at the request of the accused, who informed him that the cable had not yet come to hand. The prosecutor subsequently learnt that the accused had no account at the bank. The accused reserved his defence and was committed for trial in the Quarter Sessions. He's listed as a music teacher living in Darlinghurst in 1897. And in February 1897, in the Sydney Morning Herald, Cecil Royal Aubrey pleaded not guilty to a charge of on the 18th of December obtaining from Henry Davis the sum of £7 by the means of a valueless cheque. The accused admitted having given the cheque, but asserted it was given to Davis at the latter's own suggestion to be held as security. And the jury did return a verdict of guilty, and for this he was given 4 years penal servitude. His name on his New South Wales record as a result in 1897 was Cecil Royal Aubrey. It stated that he was born in England in 1861 and came out on the Beecroft, but didn't state when, and stated that he was a musician. On this record, his aliases are listed as Thomas Henry Penney and Cecil Devine. On the 30th of March 1900, so virtually as soon as he's been released, he was convicted at Glenorchy, Tasmania for false pretences and given 1 month's jail, and was discharged on the 29th of April. He stated on his Tasmanian jail record that he was born in 1864 in Wiltshire, England, making him 3 years younger than he actually was, and he also stated he was a widower and a musician. On the 30th of October 1900, in the Hobart Tasmanian News, false pretences. Cecil Royal Aubrey and Ada Rourke were charged with obtaining £1 13 shillings and 6p from Mrs. Burgess of Tasman's Peninsula by means of a valueless cheque. On the application of Superintendent Pedder, the charge against Ada Rourke was withdrawn. Aubrey, who's already served a sentence of 4 years in New South Wales for the same class of offence, was sentenced to 2 years' imprisonment. And on the 3rd of November 1900 in the Hobart Clipper, Love's Mixed Dream, Ada and Another in Arcadia. Somewhere about February of this year, Cecil Royal Aubrey, aged 35, stepped from the portals of Darlinghurst Jail in New South Wales a free man. He'd spent 4 years in Darlinghurst with occasional excursions to certain rural prisons. He'd been convicted of obtaining money by false pretences and had done his time. What then? He was free again. Saving for the scrutiny of the jaundiced eye of the gentlemen of the police, he was still youngish and he had his wife for assets. He set forth with a high spirit. About April, Mr. Aubrey landed in Hobart, following furtively in the wake of a theatrical company, and described himself as a musician. In very little time he found himself short of money, and those wits of being barren of a better expedient, he sold some bogus tickets of admission to the Theatre Royal to Cook and Son and unsuspecting people of Glenorchy. The fraud was discovered, and Mr. Aubrey went to Hobart Jail for a month. In those holy precincts, under the ministration of the chaplain, Mr. Aubrey's soul was touched. He was all ablossom with white promises. Mr. Aubrey had some scraps of a good education and wore them all on top, well furnished and greatly to the gratification of the chaplain. The penitent announced that he was an expert piano tuner. He fixed up the jail organ. He repaired good Colonel Warner's piano so successfully that the neighbours said the warders rejoiced with one accord. This, said the chaplain, is a sweet, deserving soul. Mr. Aubrey left the jail with a set of piano-tuning instruments and a very neat halo. About this time, Mr. Aubrey appeared to be very much at home in a certain notorious house in Barrack Street. Mr. Aubrey, deeming it not to be good to live alone, was even making serious love to a resident of the said home, a lady industriously following, these 4 years back, the oldest profession in the world. About this time, a lady living in Montpeter Street got 2 boarders. Mr. and Mrs. Aubrey were what it is called nice people. Mr. Aubrey was a gentlemanly man with spectacles, and interestingly, as an invalid. Dear Ada, Mr. Aubrey's fond fair wife, was a sweet creature who gave no trouble. On the whole, they were very good boarders. Ada was a comely girl enough, had not apparently been unduly battered in the way of sin. She always seemed to have been respectable and decent in her outer demeanour, even with her occasional encounters with the police. At this time, piano tuning seems to have paid pretty well, and the happy couple entertained their fellow boarders, good-looking young fellows, artistic by profession, on Sundays. Mr. Aubrey was a methodical person at times. A rough account he kept just then, it shows that his actual receipts from the 30th of April to the 12th of May was £6 15 shillings and 6 pence. There were a number of items paid to Ada. By this time Mr. Aubrey was doing a good deal of work, despite the distractions of the honeymoon and rheumatics. Yet he found it necessary to add to his income with an occasional loan from the boarders who sympathised with the invalid and his pretty wife. On a slip of paper now in the hands of Her Majesty, he wrote a description of himself by way of a draft of a business card. It says Cecil R. Aubrey, Montpelier Street, Hobart, piano and organ expert, London diplomas, tuning, regulating and repairing, moderate fees, references to leading residents, all work guaranteed for 6 months. On the whole, it would seem that Mr. Aubrey, for all of his days of gold and nights of purple with dear Ada, took his business function fairly seriously. Ada, too, seems to have had some social connection, for among her papers recently there was a letter from truly a high and honest lady of the upper circles, which had gone through the post office to Ada, duly franked by a member of Parliament. The ladies of society, however high and however honest, don't waste money on postage stamps when there is a friendly legislator near at hand. Mr. Aubrey left Montpelier Street, but before doing so he borrowed a horse and trap from a kind-hearted butcher. The next we find them is a little down at Dover. At Dover, Mr. Aubrey found a very promising dupe in a local lady, Mrs. Boggs. Mr. Aubrey said he knew musicians in Sydney that could write music for Mrs. Boggs. Mrs. Boggs gave him money for this music to be written, and then from Dover they went quickly to Sorrel, and Mrs. Boggs heard no more of them until she received a letter from Mr. Aubrey, dated from the Sorrel Hotel, explaining that he had not forgotten the music, begged the postess not to despair of fame, promised to give the matter his immediate attention, and finally mentioned that he was laid up with rheumatism and modestly asked for another £1. Mrs. Boggs did not honour him with that extra £1. Mr. Aubrey stopped in the hotel at Sorrel for some time while he canoodled with Ada and tuned various pianos about the neighbourhood. He liked the hotel, it seems. The fare was good, the room spacious and sweet, and the ladies of the hostelry were very good to dear Ada. Finally, owing this hotel a good deal, Mr. Aubrey hired a buggy and pony from the landlady. The theory was he was going away for a day or two to collect money and return to pay all dues. The buggy party of two travelled through Fawcett and Carnarvon, and by boarded for a while with Mrs. Burgess at Premedina. Mr. Aubrey told Mrs. Burgess that the buggy and pony were his, and that he was rather short of cash. He would leave the pony and trap with her, therefore, as security of payment of what he owed. Also, he'd be obliged if Mrs. Burgess would cash his cheque, drawn on a Zeehan bank, for £1.13. Mrs. Burgess was glad to oblige in that way, and the happy couple left. 6 weeks ago, Mr. and Mrs. Aubrey arrived in Hobart on the New Beena and went to stay at Anderson's Coffee Palace. From Hobart, in a day or two, he slipped away, still with Ada, and bobbed up very serenely at Brighton. At Brighton, we are told, he turned pious and mixed with leading people. Then they flitted to Oatlands and Campbelltown, where they were the guests of another unsuspecting clergyman. Ada speaks very favourably of this patch of clerical hospitality. She has latterly assured certain acquaintances of the police that the clerical household was all right, and then she learnt to play croquet very well up at Campbelltown. A little later at Launceston, a valueless cheque came home to roost from Premedina. Mr. Aubrey was brought to Hobart, still with gentle Ada, and on Tuesday Mr. Aubrey faced Mr. Bernard Shaw. Mr. Bernard Shaw moralised heavily that Mr. Aubrey passed from view and went on a visit of 2 years to Colonel Warner. Ada also came up, but was not convicted of anything in particular. So on the 6th of November 1901, so 12 months later, Cecil Royal Aubrey, clothed in prison garb, wearing a pair of snips on his nose and carrying a walking stick in his right hand, was the next witness. He had the appearance of a swell, even in his branded jail suit, and said he'd been sentenced to a term of imprisonment at Hobart in October 1900. He was discharged on the 19th of April 1902, and under Cecil Royal Aubrey, Thomas married Ada Elizabeth Alette Carlton O'Rourke on the 1st of May 1902 at the St John's Baptist Church in Hobart. He was 37 and Ada 23, and this became his second bigamous marriage. Now using the name Cecil Aubrey Pierpont, he was photographed at Parramatta Jail on the 20th of October 1903 while serving a 12-month sentence for false pretences. He changed his birth year to 1866, making himself a further 5 years younger, and stated he came out on the Beecroft in 1886, still a musician. This record stated he had a bullet mark on his left forearm. At the Katoomba Police Court in September 1903, he went to jail on 2 counts of false pretences, and there was 6 months hard labour on each charge. Then under Cecil R. Aubrey, he arrived at Blackheath in or about June 1903 and took up residence in a boarding house. He appeared as a well-dressed man with education, eloquence and manners, and advertised his services as a piano and organ tuner. After a period of about 6 weeks, Pierpont announced to the Blue Mountains community that he'd come into a baronetcy and he was now Sir Cecil Aubrey Pierpont. He claimed his title carried an income of £3,000, but he'd need some local assistance to tide himself over until the arrival of the first instalment of his fortune. People readily took up the opportunity to assist Pierpont, who in turn entertained with organ recitals, good food, champagne and cigars. In September that year, Pierpont announced that he'd be leaving the Blue Mountains and signed a number of cheques to settle his debts with local businesses. By the time the valueless cheques were discovered, Pierpont was in Sydney, but he was quickly apprehended and taken to the Katoomba Police Court to face the 2 charges. The court heard that Pierpont had been dealing out cronk paper, and in the New South Wales Police Gazette on the 29th of July 1903. In Katoomba, a warrant's been issued by the Katoomba bench for the arrest of Cecil Aubrey Pierpont, charged with fraudulently obtaining the sum of £2 by means of a valueless cheque from H.J. Collier of Blackheath on the 8th. The offender is 35 years of age, 5 foot 5 inches high, slight build, fresh complexion, small eyes, clean-shaved, sharp features, long nose, cast in one eye, wears gold pince-nez and sometimes an eyeglass, dressed in a long fawn-coloured overcoat and tall hat with a smart appearance. Supposed identical with discharged prisoner Cecil Royal Aubrey, alias Vere, alias Penney, said to have gone to Brisbane, Queensland. And on the 7th of September 1903, in the Sydney Evening News, unable to find any trace. The part-heard suit of Aubrey versus Aubrey, in which Alice Hyacinth Aubrey, formerly brewer, sought a dissolution of her marriage with Cecil Royal Aubrey, a professor of music, on the grounds of desertion for 3 years and upwards, conviction of 4 years penal servitude, and habitually leaving her without support, was concluded today. The facts of the case as stated by the petitioner were that he was married to the respondent in Elizabeth Street, Sydney on the 12th of October 1896, according to the rites of the Baptist Church. After living in various parts of Sydney for 4 months, her husband was arrested and sentenced to 4 years penal servitude. He was released in February 1900, but neither wrote nor called at the address she had given him, and although she'd made frequent inquiries as to his whereabouts, she'd been unable to find any trace of him. The matter was adjourned on Thursday for the purpose of additional evidence as to the desertion being produced. Charlotte McGrath, a married woman residing in Glebe, stated that the petitioner resided with her when she was out of employment. She was living in Redfern when the respondent was released from jail in 1900. Up to the present time, the petitioner had inquired every week whether her husband had called at her place. The respondent had never called at her house since he was released, and she had no idea of his present whereabouts. In reply to His Honour, the petitioner, who was recalled, stated that her husband mentioned in one of his letters that when he was released from jail, he would go to Mrs. McGrath's place at Redfern, which address she had already given him. She was anxious to see him when he was released, but he never called at the address she gave him as he promised. She'd been informed that a person of the same description and bearing the same name and marks as her husband was at present serving a sentence of 2 years imprisonment in Hobart. His Honour granted a decree nisi returnable in 6 months. And on the 18th of September 1903, in the Katoomba Mountaineer, in the Katoomba Police Court, Cecil Royal Aubrey, alias Pierpont, was charged on the information of Mr. H.J. Collier and Mr. J. Neat with obtaining money and goods to the value of £2 9 shillings and 7 pence and £2 from the informants respectively by false pretences by means of a valueless cheque. Mr. H.J. Collier on oath deposed that he knew the accused and he knew the cheque produced. It was cashed at his shop on the 8th of July during his absence. It was sent to the bank and returned, account closed. He knew the accused just as Mr. Cecil Aubrey and then as Sir Cecil Pierpont. Miss Collier deposed that the accused came into my brother's shop on the 8th of July and wrote out a cheque for £2 and signed it in my presence. He gave me 6 pence change as it was a country cheque on the Burgh Bank. He said my brother would have cashed it if he'd been at home, and I cashed it for that reason. I had every reason to believe the cheque was genuine. In the second case, Mr. J. Neat gave evidence that he last saw the accused on the 8th of July. He came into his shop and purchased goods. He tendered a cheque for £2 9 shillings and 7 pence in payment and received 30 shillings change. He sent the cheque to Sydney and it was returned, account closed. He considered the cheque a genuine one. The accused pled guilty and elected to be dealt with by the bench. Aubrey's jail record was put in by the police, showing convictions for false pretences, forgery and larceny, and received sentences aggregating to nearly 14 years. The accused received a sentence of 6 months for each charge. And then on the 11th of November 1903, Cecil Royal Aubrey, alias Vere, alias Penney, charged on warrant with having fraudulently obtained the sum of £4 from Charles Owen, has been arrested by Sydney Police. Charge withdrawn, prosecutor having left the state. In part 2, I'll continue with covering his escapades, including where he goes to next, which is Victoria. If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.